I like the scene in American History X where he's lying in the hospital infirmary, and then his former teacher comes into him and asks him, "So, has anything you've done in this neo-Nazi movement with all this hatred and all this anger, has any of it made your life better?" And he has an honest moment and says, "No." And I think if people could take a deep breath and ask themselves, okay, you have now ranted, raved, trolled, flamed, and I do not know what, and not for lulz. I mean, like in outrage, and I don't take no BS, I shut it down wherever, like, has it made your life better, or has it just made your blood pressure higher? Like, has it made the nation better? Has it made your local community better? Has it made anything better that you rant, rave, or in the more extreme, you hate, you despise, or you fear or think of as the enemy other people? Does it make your life better? Does it make, oh, but we have to fight against them. We can't just be pushovers. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have an argument. I'm not saying you can't have a discussion. I'm not saying you can't push back. But as we've seen, the second you corral yourselves with a bunch of others who agree with you, and you start denouncing the others as the enemy, and you don't put in any nuance, you don't put in any reflection, you don't put in any fairness, that's when we start to break ourselves up.
Yeah, and I think we have a responsibility to each other to try and help each other avoid those situations. So when we are aware of misinformation, that we help each other in a positive way. I would probably venture more positive than you generally go, but in an informative and effective way, that we help each other make sure that we're keeping each other honest, that we're watching out for each other, that we're, and we're not using it for gotchas or to prove, hey, I'm paying closer attention, or I'm more wise, or those types of things. It's that because we know we're all susceptible to misinformation, it's very important that when one of us discovers that something isn't accurate or something is outright false, that we help each other discover that together, so that we don't continue to perpetuate the falsity just because it may or may not benefit a particular agenda, because that is the path to a lot of the things that we're fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, that when somebody tries to correct you, if they're doing it in not necessarily a snarky way all the time, that the intention is to make us all more informed or better informed, and keep us all honest about what we're actually dealing with, so that we can avoid being divided on things that don't actually impact us the way that we're being perceived. So Trump and immigration is a good example of how he's got a lot of people thinking that this Mexican immigration issue is so much worse now than it was yesterday or a year ago or 10 years ago, when realistically, besides the dependence that we have on immigrant workers and all of that, that really most immigration right now is coming from Asia, or a lot of it's coming from Asia, particularly on the West Coast where I'm at, in that it's a variety of different Asian people coming in, and that's actually a larger influx. And the reason that they're getting here isn't because there's no wall. It's because they're coming. A lot of people are coming in legally and then overstaying. And so the issue is actually far more complex. But by distilling it down to accusing the Mexicans of being rapists and so on and so forth, you're able to give people a very clear target, and it's easy for people to continue to feed into that unless those people are checking themselves. And if we don't check ourselves on the things like, as bad as Hillary may be, we have to be honest with ourselves about what things she has done or what she did accomplish, and we have to not just dismiss them as, well, there was also this other worse thing, but also recognizes, like, yes, some people were helped, and that's important. Lives were changed in those ways. But there were consequences, that those weren't without consequence, that other people suffered in exchange, and that's a real calculation, and that's a real impact that we have to acknowledge. We can't just look at one side and not the other.
It's like when Obama felt tears over Sandy Hook after he did his executive order. There were a lot of people doing memes and posts about his fake tears because he had been instrumental in murdering people abroad. Now, I am one of the people who have a hard time with U.S. foreign policy. Millions of people have died since the Second World War ended. So after the Second World War, millions of civilians have died. There are new studies coming out on these numbers, and they are not being widely spread. These people who have died, yes. Has Obama been an instrument in continuing that? Yes, but I do not know what it's like to be in his shoes. I do not know what it's like to sit behind the Resolute desk, having older war veterans coming in and telling me that this is what we do to secure the nation, and then having advisors telling me, you have to do what they say, they're the experts. I don't know what it's like to be under that pressure and holding an entire nation's fate in my grasp. So him having a human moment, crying over the Sandy Hook victims, I do not in any way disqualify his emotions or his tears in that moment. But as you're saying, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been great consequences to U.S. foreign policy, like Libya, which he has expressed great regret on, but also Syria and other issues in the Middle East. So just because Hillary, she tried to force fracking on my country via the EU, and I will never forgive her for that. But that does not mean that she has not in other ways inspired and influenced generations of women, inspired debates and these things. Yes, she did the super predator speech, and her husband did the criminal justice, but the symbol of white politicians catering to black people and black politicians is also a strong symbol. Now, it is coming forward that that symbol was most likely at way too high a price. But you can't simply say one completely negates the other. You have to be fair and say, okay, they did this. This had some effects. Now, the adverse effects were greater, but it had some effects. You have to be able to say that.
Yeah, and you have to be able to say that to be able to engage somebody that has that opinion, that doesn't share your opinion on how that the bad outweighed the good, if that's the conclusion that you're arriving at. In order to get there, you have to at least give them the good, at least some of it. You can disagree on the particulars of it, but you have to concede the things that are more or less irrefutable that transpired out of it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to you have to get rid of all of the bad part and junk that argument because, well, she did this good thing at this good time. Like the thing that comes to my mind is the Child Defense Network fund and all that stuff, and how that, she references that all the time, but then if you look deeper into it, you find out that the relationship there was not exactly as rosy as it's described by her side. And so, you can't say that she didn't do any of the things that were positive that came out of that, but you also can't ignore all the realities that also came out of that about the relationships and the political outcomes of welfare reform and so on and so forth. That they have to be, that you don't have to treat them as equals, but you do have to acknowledge that things happen. Because when you refuse to acknowledge reality, then the other person isn't going to accept your reality. It's just not going to happen. Because if you're not accepting at least parts of their reality, then you can't meet somewhere in the middle.